wieder auf English, seeing his name emblazoned on the beautiful new residence hall would have invoked in him, I think, a powerful feeling of wonder. Wonder in the sense of something unique and extraordinary that stops you suddenly in your tracks, that leaves you amazed, speechless, and baffled. After all, Henry Koerner didn't go to Bard. He didn't go even to college, or at least not a college like this. He lived only briefly in Berlin, about 18 months, and that was long, long ago. So it would have struck him as strange and wondrous that a college building in this city would bear his name. I should also say that for my father, wonder reigned supreme among the human passions. Wonder for him was the best response for almost anything that life throws in one's way. Wonder as the gently elevated reaction to boundaries breached, to categories exploded, and to paradoxes laid bare and left unresolved. His first huge painting on 16 canvases, fitting together in 4 rows of 4, had the title, borrowed from Sophocles, O Fearful Wonder of Man. And I think he believed, as the ancients did, that philosophy began with wonder, except unlike the philosophers, he tried to stay shocked and puzzled. That decade after his death, his name should be put up on a gleaming new building in Berlin. This, in his view, should remain a wondrous enigma. Permanent puzzlement does not, however, prevent persistent investigation. In my father's case, inquiry into the wondrous took the form of painting. Born from wonder, painting reflected wordlessly on wonder's secret cause. It gathered into a play of imagery certain unspoken resonances, often in the form of uncanny reunions of the strange and the familiar, of the present with the past. And so, in Henry Koerner's spirit, I'll reflect on some of the resonances evoked by this dedication. It's not clear where to begin, but it makes some sense to start where we find ourselves, in Berlin. March 30th, 1947, the new Kulturamt in Zehlendorf, in the Zehlendorf district of the American sector of occupied Berlin, opened an exhibition of contemporary art in the Haus am Waldsee. Built in 1922 for a Jewish clothier, this small mansion had been turned in 1946 into a gallery and performance space with a program aiming to recuperate artists who had been ostracized or persecuted during the Nazi period. The first 9 exhibitions held there were group shows of established German artists, but the 10th show was a solo exhibition of a young, unknown American painter serving in the US military government in Berlin. It was a most unusual occasion. Firstly, its curators were mostly Americans, serving in the military government's Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archive section. They were the so-called monuments men, civilians and officers charged mainly with recovering artworks stolen by the Nazis from Jews, museums, universities, and religious institutions. In the first months after the war ended, Americans in Germany had been mostly concerned with denazification, insofar as the US government reached out in an organized way to German people. It did so according to what it termed the confrontation policy. The aim of this policy was, quote, to make the German populace realize they are guilty. The most famous instance of this were the 24 or so confrontation visits in which American field commanders forced Germans living in the vicinity of concentration camps to tour the sites. But by June 1945, the US and British intelligence communities grew concerned about the political wisdom of this policy, particularly in light of a powerful propaganda campaign by the Soviet occupiers who publicly shifted the blame for Nazi atrocities from the German people as a whole to forces external to them, to big business, to monopoly capitalism, to Western imperialism, all of which, it was claimed, were presently threatening Germany anew in the form of the American occupiers. Therefore, long before the announcement of the Marshall Plan in 1948, U.S. policy changed from blame and confrontation to a campaign of winning German hearts and minds, and thereby reestablish a constitutional democracy and thus contain Soviet expansion. This new approach placed a strong emphasis on visual propaganda, mostly through the medium of film, but also through the fine arts. The 1947 exhibition at the Haus am Waldsee belonged to this endeavor. The first show of American art in the post-war Germany, it also remained a singularity. The next exhibition showed American children's drawings, and the U.S. military government never again sponsored modern art in this way. To gauge public opinion of the show, and also to peer into the minds of German visitors, the organizers created a special questionnaire with 11 questions prefaced by a paragraph saying that answering wasn't mandatory and could be done anonymously and at home. Don't be afraid, it says. This questionnaire is not a questionnaire. Diese Fragebogen ist kein Fragebogen. Germans were familiar with frightening questionnaires like this one, inquiring about affiliations with the Nazi Party. And many hoped for clearance certificates or Persilscheine like this one issued in 1948. Only 14% of the 1,500 visitors to the exhibition completed the form. Many of those respondents said that they went to the show to see modern American art, but left with the impression that the artist wasn't really at all typically American. To the penultimate question, do you believe the painter intended to cause an emotional shock in the viewer? The answers were mixed. Some praised the artist's honesty, others objected to his bleak outlook. One complained that whoever the painter was, he portrayed the Germans as an outsider would and had not experienced all that Germans had had to live through. Many of the 55 paintings and drawings on display clearly referenced the disasters of war, and one or two gestured obliquely to the Holocaust. In this, the show was unique. It was the only exhibition sponsored by the U.S. Army, U.S. military government that concerned recent German history. And indeed, it would be years before any Holocaust-related art would be shown at all in Germany in such a prominent way. Back in America, Life magazine reported that the exhibition at Haus am Waldsee, quote, created a sensation in Germany. Life's chief critic would later laud the paintings contained in it as, quote, the best to date to have come out of the aftermath of the war. Time magazine praised the painter as, quote, the find of the year and predicted for him a brilliant career. A few reviewers were more critical, though, objecting to the painter's, quote, hysterical I told you so attitude, or advising him to get over his, quote-unquote, bitterness. Such bitterness, they conceded, was understandable, given the painter's personal circumstances. His entire family had been murdered by the Nazis, so of course he was bitter. But now it was time to get over it, they remarked. In the German press, these circumstances remained wholly unmentioned, and even the exhibition catalog speaks of the paintings only in formal and art historical terms, as negotiating between the two big tendencies in modern art, abstraction on the one side and storytelling on the other. One prominent German critic noted vaguely that the painter had lived in Vienna, but when that was, he didn't say, and why he left, he didn't say either. These reviewers surely knew more than they chose to write, and some had interviewed the artist, whose native tongue was German, and who spoke English with a thick Viennese accent. The exhibition, meanwhile, was rich in stories, but it was admittedly poor in backstory. Hence, the several complaints voiced in the questionnaires that the pictures being too personal or too private. Again, uninformed visitors sensed the artist wasn't quite American. Indeed, my father had been naturalized as a U.S. citizen only in 1944 after being drafted into the Army. Discharged in March 1946, he soon joined the US military government in Berlin to serve in its graphics division, designing informational posters and illustrating newsletters and brochures, rather like this image that I showed earlier, which he made. The illustrated map of US care packages created by my father uses figures and motifs from the paintings he showed in Berlin. In his spare time, he created a group of paintings displayed in the 1947 show. These were executed in an attic studio, but they depended on pen and ink sketches and snapshot photographs made during his 2 years in the army and during his brief return in late March 1946 to Vienna. Now it is I who haven't given enough backstory to this episode. So to fill in the blanks, I will give two accounts of what led up to the Berlin exhibition, one a sort of objective Wikipedia version, the other my father's own brief and slightly fictionalized telling. So let's go with the first one, with the facts. My father was born in 1915 to non-observant Jewish parents in the Leopoldstadt district of Vienna. On his father's side, he had roots in Vienna all the way back to before 1848, when the emperor lifted restrictions on Jews residing in the city. His mother came from a family of small-scale oil mine owners in Borislav and Stry, now in Ukraine, then at the northeast reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The younger of two sons, Henry, or Heine as he was called, attended a technically oriented high school where he excelled in drawing. His brother Kurt joined the communist youth movement and enlisted Heine in making posters and potato print handbills urging revolution. Because of such activities, the police twice searched the Koerners' fourth-floor apartment on Am, demolishing furniture and arresting and beating Kurt. Henry, whom they never caught, later ascribed his fortune to cunning, perhaps to assuage survival's guilt, which in him was mingled with anger at his brother for causing his parents pain. In 1934, after being rejected by engineering school, he enrolled in the Grafische Lehr- und Versuchsanstalt in Vienna, the great design school in the city. But he loathed the complex lore of oil painting, which was drilled into students by Max Dörner's forbidding tome on the materials of the old masters. On graduating, he found employment in the studio of one of Austria's leading graphic designers, Victor Slama, who made famous posters for communists and for social democratic causes. My father's career in Vienna ended on March 12, 1938, when Hitler marched into Austria. The family spent that night huddled in their apartment while German troops, cheered by gigantic crowds, paraded in a festive procession that led around the ring street to Leopoldstadt, 1 block from Tauber. Of these hours, my father remembered the floodlights casting searching shadows on the ceiling of the darkened, curtained apartment, and he remembered the din, the sound, never heard by him before or since, of the next-door neighbor and hundreds of other people sitting alone in apartments nearby, weeping, indeed howling for joy. Next morning, he joined the queues outside the American embassy to apply for permission to emigrate. In early August, still without a visa, he managed to book an Air France flight to Milan. At the threshold of their apartment, his parents and brothers waved him off. He was never to see them again. His next months were spent in Italy, which he entered through the kindness of an Italian border guard. By 1939, he received from an American, a great uncle, the affidavit that allowed entrance into the United States. Arrived in New York, he immediately found employment as a graphic artist in Manhattan, designing book jackets for mystery and detective novels, work that developed perhaps his shock tactics and storytelling skills. On the side, he entered poster competitions, winning 3 national first prizes. This led to his employment in the newly founded Office of War Information, or OWI, where he worked together with several distinguished painters, most notably Ben Shahn, whose work instantly hypnotized my father. At the time, he had no notion of becoming a painter. Without academic training and concerned until now only with survival, he arrived at the OWI as a consummate commercial artist, and his war posters such as Someone Talked and United We Are Strong captured the contemporary imagination. But Ben Shahn inspired and provoked him, once asking, "Henry, can't you ever paint?" In 1944, he left the OWI to enlist in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but he was transferred to the Office of Strategic Service, the proto-CIA. There, alongside making several more iconic U.S. war posters, he began seriously to paint, completing by December 1944 his first painting. Titled My Parents, it pictures his mother and father as he remembered them, safe at home in their apartment on Antauer. My father later recalled how this picture derived from, in his words, quote, "a desire to recreate the room and to reconstruct the world that I sense I would never see again. It was painted purely from the heart. It was a vision," end quote. The interior envelops its inhabitants like an honor cloth or funeral shroud. The father has dozed off while reading. His thumb marks his place in the book as if to assure his son, the painter, that he will wake again. Behind him, the window opens to the city. Uncannily, the building in the far distance, in that little square planted with a tree, if you can see it, painted wholly from memory in 1944, is the apartment building where we as a family spent our summers. From my bedroom in Pittsburgh, where the picture hung, I used to delight in this view of my Vienna home as seen through the childhood home of my father. Note that that building stands near the vanishing point of the painting's veering perspective, what in German is called the picture's Fluchtpunkt, its point of flight or escape. The picture itself weaves a tenuous thread across the generations. Although the children, Kurt and Heine, are absent from the scene, their playthings lie on the table. A board game to the left, and to the right, placed near the vortex of a mesmerizing lace covering, a little ball of string. My father used to tease his mother by unwinding these balls and entangling the whole apartment in string. In the painting, my father leads the thread up, through, and around the chandelier, and lets it descend through the fingers of his mother into the lace she weaves. This twisted maze-like figure, drawn in the well-ordered home, is the child's signature and contrasts to the fabulous order of the mother's tightly knotted lace. It pictures the exiled son's connection to the mother, who weeps as she awaits his return. A few weeks after he completed the painting, my father was shipped to Europe. The picture was left behind. He would call it his primitive beginnings, and it remained his only private work, the one painting always labeled as not for sale and permanently installed above my bed. Having completed it, he felt reborn as an artist, and henceforth he made everything with a future public in mind. Aboard the SS Elizabeth that took him to England, he began to draw on small pads of tracing paper. He held these in one hand and drew fluidly with viscous India ink with the other. Drawing became, in his words, a new, uncurbed obsession. His colleagues in the Office of Strategic Service admired his speed as a draftsman. His job was turning information quickly and accurately into images, first in London, then, after the Allied victory in Europe, in Wiesbaden, Munich, and eventually Berlin. Because of his quickness, in 1946, the Army sent him briefly to Nuremberg to document the war crimes trials beginning there. My father remembers, quote, "There in 3 rows sat the murderers of my people, part of the government who in 1938 drove Jews down to the rolling meadows of the Prater to wash the earth and eat grass. But I didn't hate them. They sat there, docile and harmless, looking like all other Germans," end quote. However, my father came down with shingles and was discharged from the army. And it was at this point, in late 1946, that he resolved to return to Vienna. More than anything, it was this return that gave shape to my father's life story. Indeed, the return to Vienna also compelled him to shape his life, or at least the crucial bit of it, into a story. Already here in Berlin, while creating and curating the 16 small studies in gouache technique, my father composed one master story for his personal destiny and for his art. Entitled The Unfinished Sentence, it took the form of a short autobiographical narrative in words and pictures. Though never published, he delivered the unfinished sentence in several public slide lectures in late 1940, and he read part of it in a radio interview in 1948. More precisely, he chose 20 images from the many hundreds of sketches and studies made during and right after his return, completed or repainted them in gouache, and wrote them into a short story about homecoming. The tale begins in 1944 near Coney Island Amusement Park in Brooklyn. On the eve of being shipped out to war in Europe and taking in the America he has come to love, the artist observes a white lace curtain billowing from an open window. He writes, "I had a sudden feeling of belonging to and loving the unseen person behind the curtain, but I also felt somehow frightened. This all had happened before. It would happen again." The déjà vu fades, replaced by jukebox sounds, billboards, and junkyards of an American metropolis at its seamy edges, the type of landscape my father appreciated, both from his childhood in Leopoldstadt and through American painters and photographers of the so-called Ashcan school. But the specter conjured by the open window haunts each episode as cultural fragments of the Europe he had to flee. A plaster death mask of the poet Dante, worshipped by a mad itinerant bricklayer, a clock chiming Beethoven, boys swimming and torturing an octopus in Sheepshead Bay, the ghost rides and fun houses of Coney Island with their spooky imagery. The artist is shipped to England, crowded, quote, with 8,280 soldiers all in the same boat, end quote. He sees the human face clearly and honestly for the first time and begins to draw what he sees. Arriving in London, he wanders the streets, bewildered by, quote, the unfamiliar sight of ordinary things, end quote. Again, home returns in the state of exile in the form of remembrances and premonitions. A bombed-out porcelain factory. Like the paper houses, he writes, we made when we were children, the cardboard had the word Wienerwald on it, and a picture of elegant ladies and gentlemen strolling arm in arm through the Vienna woods. War and destruction doesn't alter human behavior, but only exposes what usually lies closed, hidden away in private interiors. Always walking, the artist observes through openings in the ruined buildings the stubborn routines of ordinary life. People primp, loiter, flirt, dance, devour pickled eel while envying their neighbor's portion. And to these everyday motifs he adds stories. The man in the hole is Sammy. He goes there to get away from his wife whom he hates. So he sits in the hole and thinks about Mabel all day and dreams about her at night, end quote. Even when, with the war over, he finally makes his way to Vienna, he only first circles his destination, delayed as he would henceforth always be, by a forest of motifs. A husband and wife who live in a cart, the Wienerwald shoe store behind a former patron with an amputated leg, the ruined Prater amusement park with mannequins piled up like corpses. Quote, everything in Vienna was changed beyond recognition, my father writes. Quote, but the children still play statues just as we did when we were kids, end quote. Children make home recognizable. Still playing, they allow the survivor to experience Vienna as a return. The game itself creates on its own an uncanny spectacle. Lined up in a row, children are pulled forward, one by a designated judge. In the instant after being yanked, the players hold their posture and pretend to be a statue. Awkward and unstable, such postures confound the pose of statues, so that maintaining balance is the object of the game. To observer, the fun lies in the grotesque image of bodies contorted but immobile. My father created the painting by sketching on separate sheets different moments of the game and combining many sketches into a composition, first in gouache, then in oil on masonite. The drawings and the paintings were all made in Seelendorf in Berlin. I've spoken with one of the children who posed for him, who named all the kids in the game: Doris Pusch, her brother Michael, and Julio Villano, the latter shown in the foreground of this photograph with my father standing at the far right. Each of the sketches freeze frames a convulsion that through play looks disturbing in children. Situated in the ruins of war, such figures call to mind pain-racked bodies, mutilations, and twisted corpses. Death, my father writes, changed the city beyond recognition, and here it transforms and alienates the game that makes home look familiar. Playing statues offered a felicitous pictorial motif of childhood, since by its rules, the game involves posing. It's a rare case of children standing still in positions hard to hold. Because he drew everything from life, the search for models for my father was a chief obsession. He recalled the Nuremberg trials, how the accused, quote, sat quietly and motionless for me, end quote. A strange coincidence of movement and arrest, the children's poses freeze-frame time, turning memories into monstrous monuments that befit the commemoration of what might be too terrible to recall. In the midst of these meanderings through Vienna, my father's past, path, and his story, though, finally come to the point. And here, if I may, I will let him tell it in his own voice. I've taken his voice from an old 33 RPM vinyl LP recording of the radio interview he gave in 1948 when he read some of the unfinished sentence. The clip is from a film I just finished that explores the history of Viennese interior design through the story of the fate of my father's childhood apartment on Am Tauber, the one depicted in his first painting. I hope you'll excuse my voiceover as we cut into the film about halfway into it, where I'm telling the story, broadly speaking, I'm telling today. At this point, my father is deciding to return to his ruined home and find out about the fate of his parents. The clip lasts 3 minutes. Oop. It's not on. Read this. Sorry. And so he decided to travel by train along the Danube River and return to Vienna. He brought with him a small Leica camera that he'd purchased in exchange for cigarettes. At first, my father walked the city's ruined center, taking snapshots of everyday life among the rubble. Then he spiraled out of the city to the abandoned palaces and parks, his path bent and delayed by a forest of motifs. It was only late in his wanderings that he crossed the Danube Canal and made his way through the Prater amusement park to Am Tauber.
I have seen enough of Vienna. Now I know what I must do. I must go to 23 Am Tauber and be told that my mother and father are murdered. On the corner of Am Tauber, a grocery store was open. the only one spared in the whole street. Frau Busch stood in the door. It was she who told me what I had known all the time. Her voice was unmoved. It had an undertone of satisfaction, but tears formed in her eyes and rolled down her grayish cheeks. I walked down the street while the tapping of my footsteps echoed from the opposite row of ruins. A puff of wind blew through the broken building and there was the sound of a piano playing some Beethoven. I looked up to the room in which I was born. I loved and belonged to that empty space behind the torn lace curtain.
In a memoir written in the 1960s, my father reports that leaving the ruins of his house on Am Tauber, that building caught here by his own unsteady camera, with bricks still blocking the sidewalk, he rushed out of the city and up into the Wienerwald. Here he sat down, quote, on the leaf-covered ground and wept. That place in the forest had been foretold. It was the very spot where, as a child on a hike with my parents, we saw a man flee up the mountainside, up a path with a gun in his hand to shoot himself, end quote. There in the woods, my father vowed first to erect a monument to his parents, but then realized how ridiculous that was. The unfinished sentence ends with a different resolution. My father concludes, and so I painted this scene in the Wienerwald. I helped my parents to walk once more in their beloved Vienna woods, and I hung the locket with its photo of their children on a tree where their ways parted, end quote. This painting, entitled My Parents, didn't belong to the series of gouaches made to illustrate the unfinished sentence. Produced first as a gouache here and then as a painting, it was my father's first serious painting, his public Opus 1. With it, he launched his artistic career. The unfinished sentence was written as the background story to it. Here in Berlin in 1947, My Parents was the show's centerpiece, as it was in many subsequent exhibitions in museums in New York. Together with works like Mirror of Life, shown here, it established him as a major figure in the post-war scene, and his paintings were soon acquired by the Met, the Whitney, and the Museum of Modern Art. With the rise of abstract expressionism, however, my father's realism went out of fashion, but in 1952 he took up a 2-year position as artist-in-residence at the Pennsylvania College for Women, now Chatham University. There he met my mother, a violinist and music major. They married and settled in Pittsburgh. Supported by a steady local patronage and by painting portrait covers for Time magazine, as you saw, he set about raising a new family and fashioning in America a beautiful home in exile. But the work of mourning begun in Vienna in 1946 was to remain unfinished for him, as well as perhaps for me. As my father's story tells it, painting originates in the failed encounter with the parents and in the attempt to recuperate that loss by picturing it. It is called to life by a view through the window into the vacant family home. He may have known it long before, and Frau Busch will have confirmed what he already knew, but only through the open window does he behold that his parents are dead. In his first painting, on the other hand, my father pictures what the open window has verified he cannot see, the motif of his mother and father at home in the safety of their living room. But this picture was made long before. My father's artistic creed, my father's artistic creed of pictures completed from life, which he stubbornly maintained throughout the era of abstraction, was thus a complex denial of the dual origins of his art. In it was repressed the unthinkable knowledge that the parents, subject of his masterpiece after death, could never ever be portrayed. Sometimes, as if through a strange lapse of memory, he pictured their faces by copying the one photograph of them he had rescued from destruction, as here in the background of a 16-panel watercolor from 1971. Yet, like the portraits of his brother Kurt, here this painting, these are clearly likenesses of the photo and not of its living subjects. Such later second-order portraits, I suspect, work less to memorialize the parents than to finish off their memory, hence their effigy sometimes as presiding deities of a shooting gallery. Yet the parents couldn't be put to rest by this or any other painting, for painting was the restlessness occasioned by their loss. It was that perpetual walk through a forest of motifs, each of which was only a yearning for and an exile from the true motif of home. And it was the motivation for our yearly passage as a family to Vienna as we traced in our experiences my father's original failed return. Where then do all these paths of repetition lead? As my father pictures it, the parents travel on ways that part at a place before the painter. Parting is appropriate here not only for its evocation of death, which is palpable in the autumn scene, with its mounds like burial heaps, and with its dead leaves, in Homer's famous phrase, like the generations of men. Parting is also appropriate for the subtle witness it gives to the concentration camps in which they died, where upon their arrival, husbands and wives, parents and children, those to die and those to labor to their deaths, were sometimes divided by a wave of the hand. The forking paths that my father paints are, of course, common in the forest. Eroded by years of use until they're sunken like ditches, they make the traveler uncertain whether, beyond the bend, they will drift apart or meet up again. In the foreground, the locket with the children's portraits gives one hopeful response. The thread that holds it, echoing the division of the path and greening the branch from which it hangs, is a loop that circles back to the beginning. This itinerary, however, is of the children. The photograph of my father and his murdered brother Kurt face us as the inverse of the faceless parents turned away. My father writes that he helped his parents once more to walk and pictures them as wandering away, yet he knew that it was he who turned his back on them in 1938 to save his life. He writes further that he left the locket where their ways parted. This locket, which I cherish as the one surviving memento of my father as a boy, yet he knew that it was they who had to leave their small possessions behind as they entered the camp. The thread between the artist and his parents, as between the living and the dead, is cut, and neither filial piety nor votive offerings will join its end. The eye can only focus impossibly on the scene's horizon, hoping to glimpse there a meeting of the ways. At the upper left, another trail seems to come into view, and the paths of the parents appear possibly to converge. But there the eye is caught in a gathering thicket of trees that almost fills the whole horizon, and concealing what little view would then be left of openings of paths and sky is that unyielding upper framing edge that closes off the scene like a coffin lid. Death forced my father to turn his parents away because he could not see the faces to paint them. He drew the figures here in Berlin, posing models in the woods around the Wannsee. The device worked for viewers. Faceless, the parents conveyed the experience of loss more inclusively, and contributed to the painting's impact when it was shown in the house on Waldsee. Yet the turned figures also beget an anxiety that they aren't family, and that were they to turn, their features would be strange. One of my father's strongest early recollections was of lagging behind his father in the crowded Proctor amusement park, only to find, when he caught up and grabbed the man's hand, that he had been following a stranger and was totally lost. The faceless couple places the beholder in the role of a sole survivor who, against all he or she knows, imagines behind every turned figure a familiar face. The personal remains cryptic, and this made my father's paintings more puzzling and yet also more palatable in 1947. Who gets remembered and who is forgotten? These are anyway contested matters. As it happened, my father never investigated where, when, or how his parents died. In 1997, actually on Lisbeth's insistence, I finally went into the archives to find these things out, and it was easy to do. A so-called deregistration slip indicated that on June 9th, 1942, quote, Leo Koerner and his wife Feige are deregistered to Minsk, end quote. The archivist who brought me the slip immediately linked it to the transport list of a train, DA 206, departing from Vienna via Volkowitz to Minsk on that day. Historical research has shown that this train and the 10 others like it in 1942 that transported some 10,000 Viennese Jews to Minsk actually traveled 15 kilometers further eastward to a place called Maly Trostenets, where all passengers, with not one exception, were immediately shot in the forest and buried in great ditches. This year, my children asked whether we could go to Maly Trostenets and see the place where they died, which we did. Our visit chanced to coincide almost exactly with the unveiling of a memorial to Viennese Jews killed there. The monument is as if formed out of names, but only first names. Here, Leo, possibly, my grandfather's name. The Belarus regime refused to have Jewish victims fully named because that would obscure the some 300,000 Belarus citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish, who died and were buried there anonymously. Even though they were preserved only accidentally by the bureaucratic machinery of the Holocaust, the names remain entangled in the politics of memory. I hope that here at Bard College in Berlin, the name of Henry Koerner will be a prompt, not just for remembrance, but for broader reflections on history, on politics, on exile, and on home. Thank you.
Guten Tag, mein Name ist Florian Becker, ich habe vorhin schon zu Ihnen gesprochen. Es freut uns außergewöhnlich und sehr, dass das nächste Grußwort von Sigmar Gabriel kommt. Wir haben gerade gesprochen und Herr Gabriel hat mich gefragt, machen wir das jetzt auf Englisch oder machen wir das auf Deutsch? Wir können das gerne auf Englisch machen. Vielleicht könnten wir sehen, wie es bei Ihnen aussieht. Lieber Englisch, lieber Deutsch, ist es egal? Dann machen wir es Englisch, Herr Gabriel, okay? Gut. Herrn Gabriel muss ich nicht lange vorstellen. Herr Gabriel war Vizekanzler der Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Ich muss die Daten anschauen, bis letztes Jahr, 2013 bis 2018. Er war von 2017 bis 2018 ebenfalls Außenminister und er war davor 2013 bis 2017 Bundesminister für Wirtschaft und Energie. Davor, andere Legislaturperiode, 2005 bis 2009, Bundesumweltminister, so viele Ministerien, ich muss es tatsächlich ablehnen, und natürlich davor der Ministerpräsident von Niedersachsen, 2009 bis 2017 Vorsitzender der SPD. I will say it in English and then I will ask Gabriel to take the pulpit, unless you prefer to hold the microphone. Pulpit. I explained why we are in a church. So, Mr. Gabriel is, of course, a member of the German Parliament. He was Vice Chancellor of Germany from 2013 until last year. He was also, from 2017 to 2018, the Federal Minister for the Exterior, the Foreign Minister. 2013 to 17, the Federal Minister for the Economy and Energy, also Vice Chancellor at the time, and 1999 to 2003, the Governor or Minister President, as we say here, of Lower Saxony. So it is a great honor for us. We're very happy that you're here, and if I can invite you up to the podium, that would be wonderful. Welcome.
BECKER, Professor Baldwin, dear guests, it's a very special situation for a Protestant like me to speak. In the Catholic Church, normally it's not allowed. But we need Americans sometimes to overcome difficult issues. So, thanks for this very special opportunity. And thanks for introducing me, but the reason I accepted your invitation is a very personal one. Because my eldest daughter, today she's 30 years old, her grandma was a Jewish citizen here in Berlin, and she and her husband were killed in Auschwitz. My father, until his last days, he passed away some years from now, was a Holocaust and an Auschwitz denier. So I'm a typical German in my family. Both sides of a difficult history you can find in my biography, in my history of my family. I traveled together with my daughter to Yad Vashem and Jerusalem, and we found documents, the death and the torture of her grandma and her husband, and of course I knew what my father thought when he discussed with me about the Nazi period. So for me it's always a very special situation to be invited and to remember what happened in this country and what was possible to build up in a very new situation in this country. So it's not a day, it's a bit to wonder. The city of Berlin today is something where millions of people want to go for. And 78 years ago, there was a city where people were horrified when they heard the name Berlin. So in less than one generation, it was possible to come from Auschwitz to democratized Europe, and Germany in the center of this European continent. So it's something which has very much to do with us Germans, and in this case with my personal biography and my family. So that is much more important for me than the ex-minister. So it only shows how old I am, so please, I should not repeat. But again, first of all, thank you very much indeed for your kind invitation, and I feel very much honored that I may participate in the opening ceremony of the Henry Koerner Hall of Art College, which is not already fit enough to have the meeting over there. But the college is something special in Berlin. It emerged a decade after the wall came down from an initiative of former GDR civil liberties campaigners, transatlantics, and intellectuals whose aim was to provide a learning space that mirrors the open society. 20 years on, this idea has become an officially acknowledged college with a bit less than 300 students, if I'm quite informed, from 60 countries enrolled for the dual German-American bachelor's degree in humanities and social sciences. During 4 years, they learned both the elements of academic working and the critical personal, political, and philosophical dialogue between people from widely differing cultural and social backgrounds. The fact that amongst those enrolled here at Art College are also students that were forced to flee their homes leave behind their loved ones by civil war and political persecution cannot be emphasized enough. A very tangible contribution to an open society. It is this conscious integration of differences and diversity for which Bard College contributes to what Germany and Europe seem to require urgently in these days: critical thinking. I hasten to add, properly understood critical thinking. Critical thinking is understood properly if it doesn't lose itself in the criticism of others, but also reflects on the own thinking and acting. If it doesn't only ask who to blame or what should change, but also how it could change. The key ingredient to this is the motive of enlightenment. Sapere aude, dare to be wise. Here at Bard College, students learn the skill to master this courage academically as much as in everyday life. So, dear guests, it is the dual nature that makes the learning experience at Bard College so special. Here, students receive not only an intensive academic institution, the college understands itself not as an ivory tower detached from its environment, and thus civic engagement is an integral part of the curriculum. Students learn to take on civic responsibilities, to speak up for a good society, and by doing so, they often learn much more about real life than they could ever learn by reading a book. It is noteworthy if a college maintains such a close relationship to its neighborhood like Bard College does. So much has changed since Henry Koerner, your father, if I'm writing for it, fled Vienna in 1938. Today, Berlin is not a place of fear, hatred, and terror anymore, but an attraction to people from all over the world. The majority of them voluntarily to experience this liberal, open capital city with its complex history. Some, however, come to Berlin because war, terror, and persecution forces them to leave their homes, just like the young Henry Koerner, and their distress and fear for their lives. They often have to leave behind their families, and condemned to inactivity, have to start a new life in an alien land. In their ordeal, they often experience that there is little interest or empathy for their distress and fears. While Berlin has become a different place, a place of liberty and peaceful coexistence, in too many other places, exactly this is not given anymore. Freedom and human rights are stepped on by authoritarian regimes. Here, the everyday life is ruled by fear, terror, and mistrust. We must consider us fortunate in Europe, particularly in Berlin. History was good with us. It seems a miracle that in Europe, so deeply marked by wars, peaceful coexistence became a reality. But today we are learning just how fragile that miracle is. The European idea of peaceful coexistence is challenged by anachronistic populists, which believe that in a globalized world, the nation-state alone could solve problems. These populists promise simply fast solutions. Their slogans are aimed at our feelings and emotions, not our mind. They make use of simple reflexes that undermine the trust in democracy. With their anachronistic hullabaloo, they plan to the poisonous seed of mistrust within our societies as much as between them. That they are partially successful in this is rooted in the fact that our societies are undergoing fundamental changes. The process of change, however, creates fears, worries, and desires, sentiments the populists exploit with their cheap slogans. We must not let these forces destroy the European miracle and bring about mistrust amongst us again. We must dare to encounter new ways to foster new trust in the European idea of peaceful coexistence. Better knowledge alone will not be enough. Trust is an experience. It needs to be felt rather than told. Only then the mid-cuffs, mind-cuffs, fears and worries can be reduced and mistrust be replaced I trust. With its works and orientation, Bard College makes a direct contribution to experience distrust in humanity and solidarity for its students as well as for its Berlin neighborhood. I could not imagine a better name given for a student hall that, at least for some time, would be the home for young people from all parts of the world than Henry Koerner. His life and his achievements remind us constantly to never forget the value of a peaceful life and freedom. That this building is in Berlin, the city that 80 years ago was synonym for terror, death and destruction, a beacon of freedom and diversity today, serves as evidence that peaceful coexistence between nations and peoples is possible, and also that this coexistence is constantly under threat and in need for protection. Ladies and gentlemen, when John F. Kennedy held his famous speech in Berlin, he said, "All free people, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man," he said, "I'm proud to be able to say, ich bin ein Berliner." When Kennedy said Berlin, he meant freedom. I hope that after the graduation, the students of Bard College that live and study here in Henry Koerner Hall and other students halls today and in the future will look back and proudly say, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and mean the idea of freedom, that they will courageously speak up against all those seeking to discredit or destroy it, and that never give up the belief in peaceful coexistence. Thank you very much for your attention.
Let me say only, for the sake of time, that he's also been well integrated into the Bard College Berlin curriculum. I myself have had the chance to teach his work, the Rwanda project, in 2012, when there was a retrospective of Jaar's work in the BUNDESTAG gallery, and our students were extremely overwhelmed by the work that he did in the Rwanda project to make us rethink the relationship between image and political action. And just this semester as well, our students have studied his a fairly recent piece called The Geometry of Conscience, which is a memorial that's installed at the very entrance to the Museum for Memory and Human Rights in Santiago, Chile, in Jaar's native country. We're extremely happy again to have you here today, Alfredo, Jaar, and we very much look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you for this very generous introduction. And thank you, Vendetta, for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. I also want to thank the students. I just saw a fantastic exhibition. I was very moved by the intelligence of the work, the poetry of the work. I was illuminated by what I saw. I was truly impressed. So thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing and the work that you will do. Every time I start writing a speech, and I'm reminded of Paul Valéry's words. Optimists write badly, he said. To which Maurice Blanchot replied, but pessimists do not write. So badly, but with optimism, I'm here to celebrate the opening of this magnificent new student residence, but also to celebrate your future. I will start paraphrasing Chinua Achebe, the great Nigerian writer. Life is our constant effort to create for ourselves a different order of reality from that which was given to us. What order of reality was I given? I was in Santiago de Chile on Tuesday, September 11, 1973, when the Chilean military overthrew President Salvador Allende, who died during the coup. General Augusto Pinochet, sponsored by the CIA, seized total power and established a brutal military dictatorship. How can I forget the vision of tanks and infantry troops surrounding the presidential palace? Hawker Hunter fighter jets bombing the president's quarters. President Allende besieged in the palace, refusing to surrender, and addressing the nation for a last time in an unforgettable farewell speech minutes before dying. Thousands of desaparecidos, a million exiles. How do I change that order of reality? You can still find graffiti on Santiago's walls with Salvador Allende's words. He wrote, "To be young and not to be revolutionary is almost a biological contradiction." I repeat, especially for you, students of Bard College Berlin, please do not forget these words. To be young and not to be revolutionary is almost a biological contradiction. But I'm here to speak about your future, to dream about your future. And that future is now. And the order of reality that you must change is now. All around you, all around us. These are dark times, difficult times, where culture has rapidly shifted toward what Susan Sontag called an increasing acceptance of brutality. There are 69 million refugees in the world today. Most governments have been despicable in their reaction to this crisis. Germany, through Angela Merkel's government, was the only European country that for a few precious months opened its doors to almost 1 million refugees. While Turkey welcomed 3 million people, Lebanon welcomed 2 million, and Jordan welcomed 1 million. Europe, the entire continent, panicked about 1 million people arriving at its shores. That million represented less than 0.1% of Europe's population. In the United States where I live, refugees flying terror from Central America are being welcomed by tear gas at the US-Mexico border. United States immigration officials are tearing apart families and separating children and babies from their parents and taking them miles away to unknown locations where they are kept in cages. Dozens of these children have died in custody. More than 500 have suffered sexual harassment. This monstrosity is happening right now. This is the order of reality you are facing. These are dark times. These are difficult times, where our society, as Adrian Rich wrote, is trying to grapple with the displacement of the social will into the accumulation of money and things. Accumulation of money and things. Is this the society we want? A society of spectacle and consumption, where everything around us asks us to consume, consume, and consume? Accumulation of money and things. Is this the world you want? According to United Nations report released last week, up to 1 million plant and animal species are on the verge of extinction, with alarming implications for human survival. In fact, our planet is facing serious critical consequences in only 12 years if we do not act now. Irresponsible, criminal governments and corporations all around the world ignore this tragic fact and do nothing. As a Norwegian philosopher once wrote, "We have everything, but that's all we have." Thousands of students from around the world are striking, marching, protesting every Friday against this criminal inaction, asking, demanding, imploring politicians to act. Who is the leader? A young Swedish girl, 16-year-old, Greta Thunberg. Clearly, my generation has failed you. Politics has failed you. You must act to save our planet. As Kenzaburo Oe, the great Japanese writer, wrote, speaking to his son's generation, your generation. Teach us to outgrow our madness. This should be the cry of my generation to yours. Teach us to outgrow our madness. To be young and not to be revolutionary is almost a biological contradiction. How do we keep on living in the midst of so much pain and suffering surrounding us? As John Berger put it, the pain of living in the present world. This new student residence is the home of these questions. And please tell me, how extraordinary is it that this home was created thanks to a man who lost his home and family? When I think about Henry Koerner, I remember the words of the extraordinary Russian poet Anna Akhmatova. She wrote, "So much to do today. Kill memory, kill pain, turn heart into a stone, and yet prepare to live again." Henry Koerner killed pain, but did not turn his heart into a stone. His heart kept beating, and this new student residence is the living proof. This new student residence, this place, inside this college, offers you the last remaining space of freedom. That freedom is precious, and it is yours. Take it, use it to dream, use it to fly. That freedom lies in a system that you will create. As Blake said, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's system. Create your own system, invent your own world. But whatever you do, always connect. Connect. Connect with another human being. Connect. Create bridges. Connect. Because to connect is communication. And never forget that communication does not mean to send a message. To send a message is not communication. Communication occurs only when you get an answer. An answer means communication. An answer means you are communicating. An answer means you are connecting. Provoke these answers. Search for them, here around you or around the world. Williams Carlos Williams wrote one of the most illuminating poems of the 20th century. In one fragment, it says, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." There. Where is that place called there in this magnificent poem? This there has to be created by each generation. That is your task. That is your extraordinary task and privilege. You will create that there. You will create that place. Today, you will be entering this new student residence, this new great place of learning to go there. There that you will create for yourselves, but above all, for all of us, with poetic imagination, with social justice, and above all, with creativity. How far the new fascism expands will depend on how committed you are to defeating it with cultural artifacts, with cultural productions, with cultural writings, with cultural strategies, with cultural programs. I am not advocating for you to correct all the dire balances of the real world, but I would like to suggest that every effort should be made not to replicate so perfectly those imbalances. To be young and not to be revolutionary is almost a biological contradiction. You can hold back from the suffering of the world. You have free permission to do so, and it is in accordance with your nature, Kafka wrote. But perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering that you could have avoided. You're now ready to enter this place. It is the place of the dreamers. You're not alone. You're ready to create a different order of reality from that has been given to you. It is the place of the dreamers. Despite these dark, difficult times, I wish you a fantastic journey into this place, the new Henry Koerner Hall. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, let me thank you for coming to this open forum and discussion, and my role as a moderator is really to get the discussion going. So I thought I would ask, just in general, maybe starting with Joseph Koerner, because we're dedicating the Henry Koerner Hall, to ask the question from the vantage point of today, whether one is a working artist or an art historian, in your case, a curator of a museum that has a lot of contemporary art. What does the experience of your father's generation, the experience of migration, forced migration, involuntary exile, it's not as if someone, he left voluntarily, and the making of art, and how that, somehow that experience, what does that, is there something to be gained or learned, or is there something about that period of the relationship of art and politics that is germane to today, to what's happening today? Is this a usable past?
Is it? Yeah. So it's a big question. I'm an art historian. Art history usually thinks about objects as being their friends, and they're beautiful things. People argue on their behalf, and people who support museums are called friends of the museum. But I suppose in my own experience, from the very beginning, seeing a painter who was dealing with his experience in the art form, it was clear that you couldn't understand his paintings except for a very complicated backstory about trauma and amnesia, about remembering but not remembering, about painting as always based on some unsettling past. And certainly when I went into, for him, the worst career you could possibly have was an art historian, because he hated art historians. They always were blind. But when I went into it, I suppose what was clear to me, and I think it was clear to many people who were interested in culture, that in like the words of Walter Benjamin, that works of art are also monuments to barbarism. That behind every work of art there is not just the face of a friend, but there might be a face of an enemy. And that art can do different things. It can be comforting, but it can also actually be poisonous. And I think in today's world, I see it certainly in the United States. The teaching of art history has really changed a lot because of extreme changing diversity of the students. Greater diversity means greater interest in who gets represented. What are the people on the walls of our galleries? What are the people represented in the pictures on the walls of the gallery? And if you are an art historian who believed from the beginning that pictures are just friends or a gathering of like-minded, ethnically similar people, it's very hard to deal with today's students, today's issues without just becoming completely irrelevant. And I think that, in a way, the art historical community had always been aware of that. And in fact, my profession was built largely out of emigres who introduced a way of thinking about art that was always in some ways oppositional, and also understood that there was something underlying art that could be mobilized for understanding contemporary problems in our civic life. So for me, the practical task, in a way, is to think through how art has that duality. You can teach it as a friend, you can teach it as friends to friends, and one hopes one can, but there's also this side where art understands and copes with enmity, hatred of one group towards another, of incoming people to outgoing people. And actually, the film that I made was really about understanding my own father's art from the perspective, and of his exile from the perspective of the next door neighbor. That it wasn't some large group of people, there wasn't some bureaucracy, there wasn't some larger process of history only behind it. It was literally the next door neighbor of that apartment that he represented who threw them out. And so the question of the neighbor, the question of friends and foes as a cultural condition is something that I found I learned a lot about, and that can carry over into understanding the many different ways that art functions, and again, not always in a way of amity, but sometimes in enmity.
I have a very different experience because partly I can say that my father was not an exile, basically because he didn't have the time. He might have been, but he was imprisoned before. He was a political prisoner for most of my childhood. And that's not a very different experience, I think, but no, it is different, but also similar in many ways. I grew up in Syria, where art was a very rare thing to find. It was very precious. So when I would watch a film, a good film, it would be somehow brought on a VHS tape from some far relative from Europe, recorded from TV. Probably from France, so it would be in a good color system called Sigmar, so we would watch it in black and white, although it's colored. And then this would mean that I would have to watch each film at least 20 times because it's so precious. And then I became an expert on particular films, for example. Now, what do I mean by this? Just to describe the value of artistic work when disconnected from its abundance that one can experience in Europe or in the West today. Now, from this, I never understood the question of the connection between art and politics. I was always, and still is, see them as one. I never learned how to disconnect them. I think what I can easily disconnect is politics, but not the political, if I may say. And in this sense, it's about our existence. So who are we? Are we, what is our political, each one of us? Now, to me, when I listen to Alfredo Jaar speaking, I know, start thinking about communication. Alfredo was speaking beautifully about waiting for the response. And I can tell him, I grew up in a home where we were always listening to the speech of Allende when I was a kid. I grew up in a home where Victor Jara was a daily thing, where Violeta Parra was a very important in the repertoire of my mother's music listening. I never heard back from you guys. Could you call us back, please? And this means that art was a matter of connecting to the rest of the world in a place where you are not allowed the abundance of resources. This means that it's so precious and valuable. And then I arrived as an exile to Europe. But way before that, actually, the first time I came to Europe, I went and I remember thinking I was queuing in the Rotterdam Museum in Paris with many young people, and to me it was the most exciting moment of my life. I'm going to see some Rotterdam. I was very young, I was still excited about Rotterdam. But then I was looking at this and thinking like, they have this. It's casual. You can wake up in the morning and go to the museum and see Rotterdam. I didn't. They must really make better art than ones like people like me or people of the South, so to speak, who do not have access to this abundance. And I think time is not showing us that this is the point. I think, to me, this is what's inspirational about this concept of liberal art, or of liberal art education, of art college. The pluralism and the democratic process seem to be what I would have dreamed to enjoy. But I invented it for myself. I studied in a dictatorship under dictatorial teachers, and then I found myself stuck in the books, in the few VHS tapes, in whatever magazines I got, and I found my own freedom, my own self-confidence, my own opinion, my own process, not only in the school. So first I want to say that I am political. I don't need to be political. And art in this sense is by default me.
So I could ask you to ask me the question again.
In a desperate effort to get a conversation going, speak to the right side of the microphone. I'm trying to get either some controversy or some kind of helpful insight. So we just dedicated a building to an artist that fled because he was Jewish.
Yeah, I understand.
And established himself first as a representative of the conquering forces, in a way, coming to Germany, and became an artist. And as I understood Joseph Koerner correctly, working through a filter of memory and of loss and of death and of guilt, being the only survivor, returning to the past. And as I think Joseph Koerner pointed out, it's fascinating that someone of his age, born in 1915, would have had even nostalgia for the Vienna that he left, which was a horrific, violent, nasty place dominated by Austro-fascism long before Hitler showed up, where anti-Semitism was, and the Leopoldstadt, where they came from, the Eastern European Jewish immigrants that arrived between the war, were starving hunger, a terrible place, really terrible place. So much for the beautiful Blue Danube, or the Prater for that matter. But now here's an individual who grows up in a hostile environment, then is thrown out, and then gets a footing in the United States and makes fantastic art and is a complex personality. And works the art. So the question I tried to raise is, and you worked with Ben Shong, the question then is, how does the personal and the political, is this experience from that generation relevant to the circumstance of the artist today?
So I've got two answers to this. My father was Turkish Cypriot. My great-great-grandfather was a slave in the Ottoman Empire. He was from Sudan. My mother's side of the family, my mother come from a very poor family from East London, and her family were gypsies. So my father was an immigrant to England in 1948. He came on a £10 ticket. And my mother come from a very diverse background, from a gypsy background. My father was very, very dark-skinned. My mum was very white with very blonde hair. And they met in 1958. They had an affair. They were both married. And in 1963, my mum found herself pregnant with this very dark-skinned man. She found herself spat on in the streets, called nigger lover. My mum and dad never got married. They continued to have an affair for 10 years. And then my mum ended up having to raise us on her own in absolute poverty. When I grew up, had no art background. I had no extra education. I had no added culture to my life. I left school when I was 13, and I've succeeded to become one of the most successful female artists of my generation. So I'd say from being outside from society, from feeling outcast from society, from always growing up knowing that I was different, even coming from a mother and father who weren't married, for example, that always spurred me on. So every time someone told me that I couldn't do something, that I wasn't allowed to do something, like I wasn't allowed to go to university, I wasn't allowed to succeed in my chosen field of being an artist, every time that made me work even harder and even more persistent and prove that I could. And that proof for me shows my level of kind of faith in art. And I've always said this thing about art. Art for me is my lover, my husband, my children, and my salvation and my God. And that's what drives me, and even as the tiniest child, without even knowing really what art was, that kind of blind faith is what always drove me. And as for politics and art, my work is deeply personal. It's about myself continually, but it's about myself being a woman, and about a woman who has a really hard time sometimes, terrible. I've been raped, I've been abused, I've been beaten. Really, I've had a lot of bad luck in my life with men, especially. And I've always made art about this, the same as I've made art about love, how I feel, about my emotions. And for a long time, that wasn't considered to be political at all. In fact, I was considered to be narcissistic and vain, even, and derided for this. Critics have often done this to me. But now, in a time of movements like Me Too and Time's Up, where women have been given much more freedom to be vocal and to be taken seriously and listened to, suddenly my work also then takes on a political mandate. It becomes political just by its own being and by my honesty about my voice and what I say. So, if you're true, then your work and your actions by themselves will become political.
So just a few reasons. I have no story like that, but I do know Henry Koerner's work. The Lincoln Museum has 4 wonderful examples, one of which has been on view the entire time we built our new building. So for 5 years, a Mirror of Life has been on view, which I think in a way sums up Koerner's aesthetic. It's Joseph showed a slide of the nude man looking out his window at a world, perhaps a dream world. There are various vignettes of people going about their everyday lives with the story of the picture of Cain and Abel on a hill in the background to suggest in some ways that the world is always going to be involved in crisis and that justice doesn't necessarily win out. I also know Henry Koerner's war posters. My son is a historian and has a collection of World War II posters, so I've lived with several of Henry Koerner's fantastic propaganda pieces. But in terms of your question of what contemporary artists, and Tracy is very much in line with this, I've always thought that one of the things that art does is it offers a window onto the world. It gives us a visual picture in a way that words often can't do of what the spirit of an age is. And there's certainly various times in the world when artists have been impelled to look at the world around them and create images that are much more political, much less involved with personal introspection, and much more a reflection of the world and its barbarity. We're living in a time right now when we're facing economic injustice, inequality, racial injustice, the barbarism of a world at war, migration, immigrants that are being turned away, as we said, at the border. And I think that contemporary artists are responding to that need, as they have in other moments in history when the world has seemed to be falling apart and in crisis. And I guess the question really for contemporary artists, because many of them, I would say the majority, are involved in depicting that world and somehow trying to create a better world because of it, because of their work. But the question is, how does propaganda work? How best can an artist not only express his or her perceptions about the world and describe a world that does seem to be chaotic and unjust, but how then can you persuade people to make the world better? And that's really an issue that I think is on the table now as artists turn in great numbers to really trying to describe the barbarity, injustice, and inequality of the world that we live in.
So if I can sharpen this conversation a little bit, so Henry Koerner was in a generation where after 1945, there's I'm going to intentionally misunderstand the challenge that Adorno put down, which is essentially, how is it possible, I think he had lyric poetry in mind, but how is it possible to make art after Auschwitz? How is it possible? How is it possible to render the aesthetic? Given the barbarism, I'm a musician, so I'm in great shape because I don't know what I'm talking about. But in writing music, for example, the idea of writing beautiful music in an old-fashioned way, melodic music, is a kind of crime, because that music was actually part of the lying, the barbarism behind the art that allowed people to be complacent. The beautification. Beethoven was used to celebrate Hitler's birthday. So, big deal. In 1989, Bernstein changes the words and does it for the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's simply a kind of it's a tool. And more important than that, it can camouflage. I make art about oppression, it's sold in Art Basel, and I become rich and famous because I've exposed in an aesthetic form an evil in society. Does the art do anything? I mean, the idea that art is a kind of something you can put on the battlefield for justice seems preposterous. So the question is, apart from the very personal, which clearly in your father's art, so how does one reconcile the making of art with the question, given the injustice or the barbarism of the world, how can one be an artist?
I answered that. I said, with honesty, with true honesty, then you can. But if you're faking it, if you fake anything in life, then it shouldn't be there, it shouldn't exist. Being an artist isn't about making a picture, it's not about making an object, it's not about making the table to put the glasses on as a useful object. Being an artist, for me, is about conviction of the soul and being honest with that. And if you're not honest with that, then you are not an artist, then you don't. And those musicians that were composing music, they thought they were maybe connected to heaven in some way. They were listening to music, they were making music, they were not conversing with evil. That was the difference. Like, take Matisse. I always use Matisse as an example. What was Matisse doing during 2 world wars? He made no or little reference to any of those wars within his work. But there's hardly anybody in the world that would say that Matisse wasn't justified as being a great artist. They wouldn't question him. I would question him.
I join. No, I think go ahead. And to me, when I see a great artist who made propaganda posters, I don't have, after I did produce some, I work in documentary film. That's the most vulnerable art form, I think, to cross over to politics and to being accused of being non-artistic or too artistic. Because documentary film is expected to speak about the truth. This is why I personally hate the concept of truth altogether. And in this sense, I would say, why do I accept somebody doing propaganda? Because I was with the Allies against the Nazis. I was not even there. I think I would probably be with them. But I would stand against any propaganda art. And I would think, is it even art? It is because of who he is, because of his personal experience, that then I understand the choice of doing propaganda, even if it was for a good cause. this maybe also has to do with my own experience, with me watching some of the films I produced about my country, Syria, in the past 8 years, and look at the film 2-3 years later and think like, a bit of propaganda. It is, and like I still believe that we did it, I did it, the filmmakers I worked with did it, because we could not sleep at night, we could not survive if we didn't shout out what we wanted to say. And in this sense, I think this is part of the entire issue of creativity. Koerner must have said, if you can not write, please don't. And I think it's the same in all of these forms. So, is it political? It depends on who you are in your story. Is your art political? I bet it is. But then the problem between generations to me now is trying to recognize what is the political. Because as much as I consider myself on a daily basis engaged with the questions of Me Too and so on, I consider that it's part of my daily work for 2 years now. I still feel like there's a new generation in the West who are living the political as being gender, identity, and environment, and escaping everything else. As if there is something about these three aspects or three political questions which is okay to tackle today, but then who cares about what's happening in China? What's happening to people there? Who cares if there was a massacre somewhere? Who cares if, and that I think is a question to the new generation that I don't know how to answer yet. I'm trying also to figure out what is political in the sense of, is it only about me? So if I am not the massacred, I don't care. If I'm not guilty of somebody being massacred, I don't care. So to me this is a question that I don't know how to answer.
Just maybe to bring in another issue here. It comes from the relationship between the personal and the political, or the relationship between the personal and art is something that certainly impacted my father very directly. That is, he believed passionately that everything from the posters of, say, waste fats through the early pictures about kind of Holocaust-related themes, through this Time magazine, they were divinely inspired things in him to express himself as an artist. He believed that he was the unsurpassed master of his time. The problem was that his personal was something, even in the beginning, too personal. And then it became so kind of eccentric when he shifted styles and started painting Pittsburgh and Vienna, that it basically lost a public. That is both an interesting thing about art, but it's also a story about exile, because he was a painter who came from Austria. He wasn't trained as an artist. He was trained as a graphic designer. But he came to the United States, immediately became a kind of European version of graphic design. That's why he was hired. He had the sort of look of Weimar Germany, but he could do it in a new American mode. Then he starts to paint. The Americans like his painting. Then all of a sudden abstract expressionism comes in, and as he has pointed out, not only was it not his style, they didn't want to hear anything about the Holocaust, war, memory. Bam! There was going to be nothing storyline. There was going to be no story. It was all going to be about form. So, and then they looked at his painting and they thought, it's so European. It looks too European, way too European, and too much about the past. So the question is, that's I think an open question, is about destiny. You know, sometimes the personal becomes political because of the nature of belonging to a movement, belonging to a generation, belonging to a larger whole. But I think it's probably a strategic question on the part of artists. One that I have to say my father didn't ask himself, which is, do you do anything about moving the personal into the political? You think of Warhol, same generation decision. Let's just go for pop culture, junk culture, consumer culture. It was actually a very, very important vision of how to make an artwork that would speak to giant consumerism. But it is a problem, and I think it's a particular problem, and maybe for here, if you are an artist who is displaced, Because if you're an artist, you're a displacer, you're working in relationship to two things. One is your art, and then you're working with a different audience. Is the audience going to be able to hold on to understand the particular creations? So exile has its own, brings with it its advantages and its disadvantages, because it plays havoc with the relationship between the public and private, possibly. It's just a thing.
I want to ask Barbara a question. So the question of honesty and the question of propaganda. You're about to open a show of the Mexican artists, Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco in New York, and been working on this question of public art, political art, and personal art, and its transplantation to America. What do you learn from that about the personal, the notion, the autobiographical, the personal experience, the issue of honesty, whether or not the usefulness of the art, advancing in some cause?
Well, I think what Joseph is saying, what's important is the idea of communication. And what the U.S. artists learned from the Mexican artists was that one, through the art, had to communicate. Art had to be public. It couldn't just be private. And it couldn't be so esoteric that no one could understand, that it had to deal with fundamental questions of existence and society, the relationship of revolution, the relationship of people to their government, but it had to have a kind of relationship with everyday life, that art couldn't be something in a museum that was separated from the fabric of society, that art was something that had to be part of what life was. And I think that during the 30s, certainly when the U.S. was adrift, we're facing the Depression, 1/3 of the population was unemployed, and the country was really trying to find a sense of what would sustain it into the future. John Dos Passos talked about, the desire, the need to find firm ground, he called it, that other men had stood on. That the Mexican example of giving voice to kind of moral outrage and revolution, social justice, was something that was appealing to American artists as they really sought to come to terms with their own kind of crisis during the 1930s. And I was saying that I think, in a sense, we're in a similar moment now, where there's a desire on the part of artists to give voice to the moral outrage that people are feeling. But the question is how to make it public, how to make it communicate in a way. Joseph, you're saying your father, in some ways, after his initial success, maybe failed being able to communicate what he was feeling. So it's not a question just of desire. It really is a question of connecting the desire to communicate and really succeeding at finding a vocabulary that people can understand, in a language that can be understood.
So if I can shift the question to another, which I'm curious about everybody's reaction. So one thing that artists do, I think, is make something that exceeds one's own mortality. So here we are looking at Henry Koerner's work. He died more than a decade ago, or a long time ago, and was born in more than 100 years ago. And there is an erasure of memory and history. So people are going to look at this work. Young generation, you're going to make art, we're all going to make something, and somebody's going to look at it. Bruegel, going to look at Bruegel. We have forgotten completely about whatever happened in centuries past. In music, in my own field, take two examples. Carmina Burana, which was an intentional effort on a composer to curry favor with the Nazi regime, which had become the most popular choral piece all around the world. Nobody has any idea, unless they think about it, what connection this has to the advancement of fascism, which there was seriously. Or Shostakovich, now listened to by everybody as a kind of music of personal confession, which was actually official music for under Stalin and after Stalin. So now somebody listens to it and plays it. What happens? What do you think about? Not only what your current audience, the audience so the paintings that your father did, that will hang on be seen on a video screen or hang on a wall, and somebody somebody coming in who's 18, 19, 17, looking at it, has no idea, never heard of Austria, never heard of Vienna, never heard of Nazis, never heard of Franklin Roosevelt, never heard of the Second World War, not part of their life, any more that somebody looking at Bruegel can tell you 10 coherent sentences about the history of that time. What does that tell you about art and its public, or art and politics?
I was looking at some de Kooning paintings with a friend, and she's very knowledgeable and amazing, knows a lot about de Kooning. So I said to him, isn't it true that he was incredibly bad to women and treated his wife appallingly? And my friend said to me, just look at his paintings, he is such a fantastic painter. And I said, yes, but when I look at his paintings, I also wonder, maybe they're fantastic paintings because he didn't give a fuck about women. He completely derided them, and it does. And she said to me, does this matter? When we look at a de Kooning painting, we look at a fantastic painting. I don't know the answer to that, like you don't know the answer to your own question. Does that matter? That's the personal and the politics as well.
But if you knew nothing about it, I always wanted to have a museum where there were no labels and no titles.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? And you don't know who did it, why, and when, right? So this nozzle person knew who the painter was. Right? What does it mean to say it was a fantastic painting?
Well, I think that, in a way, what the artist's intention is almost irrelevant. What does the public receive from it? It could be a terrible, terrible person. There's a show right now of Nolde, who turns out to be a Nazi collaborator. But does that detract from the quality of his pictures? De Kooning, whatever his personality, Jackson Pollock, what is real is what communicates communicates. Somebody can be a wonderful person and feel deeply about the politics of his or her time, but not communicate in the art, and the art then doesn't work. Art works when it really reaches a public and it is able to speak to a public. I don't think it really matters what the artist's intentions were.
I would say for the Nolde, possibly the de Kooning case, that for me, who's always been fascinated by Nolde's Nazism, and particularly by the fact that Nolde was a kind of was on the side of the people putting on the Degenerate Art Exhibition, but found himself overnight in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. I find that as a learning experience, as it were, and that I think that's one of the things that happens to art that makes it alive is precisely not bracketing off whether the person was horrible or not. I would only accept an interpretation of de Kooning if one built into it that he was a terrible person. That is, the art continues to live by being honest as a critic, just like being an artist. It means honest. You have to look things in the eye and understand that there's hatred in Nolde's portrayal, for example, of the mulatto in my museum. My museum has a very famous painting by Nolde called The Mulatto. And people looking at this picture are engaged with a set of sort of wall text which says this was a very meaningful picture about the experience of otherness. He had been to the South Sea Islands and he was embracing racial. Completely not true. I mean, he's looking at this person and he's looking at her with the same kind of racial hatred that the Degenerate Art exhibitors used when they showed expressionist sculpture, the kinds of expressionism that we see in this church, and say, no, that's wrong.
It doesn't matter if you knew about his biography. What matters is what you feel from the picture.
But it's not just what I feel from the picture, it's what I learn historically. I engage myself in the history and in who he is and in what. It's the whole package. You have to be responsible for the whole package. And that's how art lives, is by being responsible for the whole package of history.
I think that's what I feel about my friends who are, in my opinion, former friends, for example, who are on the wrong side of history, making films advocating mass murder. I have some of those, or I had. And that's what I feel about it. But when I look at history of art, to me, here's the point. Ode to Joy of Beethoven's Ninth. When I look at this piece of music, I know it was Hitler's birthday song. I know it is now the anthem of the EU. I know it is many different things. Same goes for Carmina Burana. It's a music that I very much liked as a child. And then when I look growing up, it was when everybody wanted to make a very attractive trailer and keep everybody looking like this. They would use a bit of Carmina Burana. What's the only place you would find these two pieces put together? It would be something like a CD labeled, not 5 easy pieces, but something like that, like classical music for people who hate classical music. So what I'm saying here is that, although I certainly understand what you were saying about audience and relationship with audience, still there is a very organic link between popularity and populism. They are coming from the same linguistics root. So in a way, I would have questions to Beethoven to see when did he make this part of his music. Because when I listen to the very romantic parts of some of his work, compared to his later work, for example, I think like there's something very accomplished technically in keeping everybody on their toes and emotions and making them cry, etc. And that's not so far from populism. So in a way, I think this is your museum, your structuralism, the museum, or we don't know the context. This is how I respond to this idea. When I look at it, it's very popular, and then I discovered it was always used in a populist context.
Well, when I used to walk over a Carl Andre work, I always used to enjoy doing it because I used to think that it was kind of like a naughty thing to do in a museum. Sometimes the museum guards weren't even aware that you could walk over a Carl Andre work. So I used to just love to run across the work, run back, and just think, yeah, I just walked over, a piece of art. This feels good. When I found out that Carl Andre possibly pushed his wife out of a window, now, when I'm near a Carl Andre or I walk over a Carl Andre, I have to tell you, whether or not that information is true, I feel very differently about the work. Exactly the same as if I look at a work by someone who I know collaborated with, like, a far-right, fascist movement or something. As weak as it might make me sound as an artist, and I know that part of me should rise above all of that, knowing that information, I can't help but be pulled down on what I'm looking at. And with Nolden, this is really interesting. I think he wasn't a very good artist, full stop. Full stop. Wasn't a very good artist. So there you go, that's a great thing.
It's a matter of quality.
Yeah, and compared to a lot of his peer group at that time, he wasn't the best there. So there's something to be said in that, history is,
But if I may go back to something that Joseph Koerner said, so there's an analogy to the Nolde case, which one of our colleagues here was a prime mover in, and that's Anton von Webern. So Anton von Webern was a very modernist musician whose music was forbidden under the degenerate art ideology of the Nazis, but was an ardent Nazi. In other words, so he was more than Nolde, he was far more aggressive, even though his work was suppressed. And he was also an ardent admirer of Mahler's music, which the work became forbidden. Now, his music, which is not populist, nobody wants to listen to it. It has no public, right? Now compare it to Schindler's List, the tune of Schindler's List, which is supposedly is populist and supposedly evokes empathy for the victims of the Holocaust, right? The argument would be, going to be said that, in my opinion, I'm going to go through a thought experiment, don't quote me. The Schindler's List that has the overt appearance of being evoking is actually more consistent with fascism and cruelty than the Weber. Do you follow me? Yeah.
Well, it's, I think this is the question of kitsch, right?
Yeah, unfortunately it's kitsch. So I'm trying to think of a better example.
But I think that's a
Franz Wachsmann wrote a Theresian Treatise. He was a movie composer, an emigre, Viennese emigre. He also wrote a very fine, better, not so kitschy, but I would say the same thing about that the oratorio on Theresienstadt.
I think kitsch is one of those learning experiences. It's better debated than it is identified, because every era's kitsch is another era's great art, and I think in all these questions, I believe in answer to your first question about how art moves forward over the centuries, it is a story of the history of reception. Why Bruegel, totally forgotten for 200 years, comes back rather accidentally because of people understood him as modernist. All of a sudden, they thought he was a peasant. They thought that he was rustic. They thought he was primitive. History then proved that he wasn't primitive nor a peasant, but he was a sophisticated, urban, ultra-humanist kind of character. But the history of reception, which is the history of criticism and the history of engagement, is a kind of art form. It's a situation in which the past is created out of the needs and resources of the present. And so in these cases in which, say, Schindler's List music or John Williams versus Weber, I think you can't come down with a judgment, but rather a conversation like this and the creation of a critical language that can deal with what is the appropriate style to represent the Holocaust. Is it neither one? Is it sort of jarring atone music? Is it a kind of music that evokes Eastern Europeans playing violin? No. It's a work in progress. Probably the hardest thing to do. And back to the Adorno thing about you can't have art after the Holocaust. As my son knows, it's one of the most complicated sentences in the history of criticism. What does that mean? Because immediately Paul Celan writes poetry after the Holocaust and is one of the greatest poets. So it's again, the critic is a provocateur and a bridge builder to the past, and so that's why I don't feel afraid of things that are bad in the biography of an artist, not because you put a Persilschein to it, but because engaging with it frontally is being a responsible and somewhat creative critic.
So I'm going to put Barbara on the spot.
No, just interesting that Joseph, bringing back Adorno, that if one can't make art about the Holocaust, it's interesting that the art that dominated after the Holocaust was abstract.
Yes, but let me ask you.
One couldn't
yes.
depict it. One had to go into some other realm to be able to create art at all.
So, in the idea of reception and personal and political, one of the things that the images that Joseph Koerner showed of Henry Koerner remind me of Edward Hopper in a strange way. You know, those figures. And I wonder, in American contemporary art, not contemporary, but in the history of American art, you talk about the Mexicans, but is there some way where the personal, very personal and honest, has to the public a political resonance that's unexpected?
I don't think it necessarily, say Edward Hopper, even your father's paintings necessarily have a political resonance, but they have a personal resonance. They are able to trigger something in each individual viewer that reminds them of something that they've already felt. So Edward Hopper, for example, paints a kind of stillness and a sense of alienation or loneliness, the isolated figure within a crowd that everyone has felt. It reminds us of something we already know. Interesting, I think, with Henry Koerner, that the artist you kept talking about was Ben Shahn, who also was an emigre from Lithuania and had experience pogroms, so he came to America in a similar kind of way that your father did. And his work also exudes a kind of loneliness and a sense of alienation that is very communicable. That I think that people that don't know about BECKER, don't know about his history of being an immigrant, being in what he called an in-between American, living in a world that was neither wholly American or wholly Lithuanian, but somehow in between, that communicates in the paintings. So I think it's the fact that you kept bringing up BECKER is interesting because the pictures are similar in a lot of ways.
Right. No, but he learned a lot from BECKER. But I think the story of BECKER is also interesting, and we go back to the abstract expressionist, is that all of that, once Pollock, Barnett Newman came along, all of that was seen as dusty European stuff. And I would say that the abstract expression was partly a desire to forget, just not to have American art to have no memory, to have an American art that didn't dwell on the past, that was up to date, that was new, that was cleansed of memory, and anything that looked rememberable, looked like memory, had a memory even to art history, even though we know that abstract expressionism had some predecessors. It was a new beginning, and that again raises the issue of exile, which is what happens when one's work, personal or impersonal, public or unpublic, doesn't hit a chord because one is no longer built into the fabric of a world that understands your reference. And America has always had that problem because, of course, it has naturally a huge audience. But we have a completely different situation with global art today. That is, we have a different situation of how strategies of becoming world famous. How does and I work a lot on William Kentridge, how does William Kentridge's realism, which would have been in the United States completely unpalatable in the 1980s, become central because of the backstory being from South Africa, apartheid, linoleum prints, and so forth. So there's an interesting relationship between being part of a culture and being not part of a culture.
Well, speaking for myself, as I tried to say earlier, for a long while my work was really, because I made work using myself, not about myself, but I used myself as the model, the mental model. I used myself as the woman in my pictures. I didn't hire a model and make some beautiful paintings of her. I used myself and my memory, and that's what we're talking about. And as I was trying to say earlier, often critics would say she's ranting on again, she's moaning about herself, oh, how much do we have to hear about abortion again? Well, these men, or these women even, these critics, they'd never had an abortion, they'd never had to make that decision, they'd never been raped, they didn't know what it was to feel like being raped at 13. They didn't know what it felt like to feel constantly somehow on the outside of things looking in. Because a lot of those people, and this is going back to the American abstract thing, one thing that was fantastic about abstract art is it cut out society, it cut out class, and all we look at is the painting and the paint and the image and the feelings that we have. We don't have to, because we know what we're talking about, we don't have to take on anything else. And then someone like me in America that is making paintings about a woman who's been raped, about a girl that doesn't go to school, about a woman that's being abused, about a woman in bad relationships. For a lot of men, that really isn't palatable. They really don't like it. And subconsciously, they didn't like it. I've been doing what I've been doing now all my life, 30 years as an artist, professional artist. And what I was trying to say earlier about the Me Too thing and everything, I've been doing this all my life, but only now have what I've been doing suddenly become palatable and acceptable because there's an open forum for that language. And so this is also like exile. I've been in exile, actually, even though I'm very popular and I have a good career, still my thoughts and my ambition and the way I push myself has been deemed as unpopular or unsavourable, not nice. Whereas now it is totally accepted, and so is my voice, because what I'm saying now, thousands and thousands of women are screaming about, and they're being heard finally as a collective mass. And this also is what happens within history. If you take what happened in the Holocaust, no one was listening, were they? No one was doing anything about it. And only afterwards did the voice of reason and the world then say, oh, we should have been listening, when it was far too late. But because then it suddenly become acceptable, fascism was so unacceptable that it became you understand what I'm trying to say, it's complicated. And I think with art goes within fashion constantly. And it's like William Kentridge, what you're saying, he is, I don't mean fashionable like in a clothing line, but in a sensibility of the zeitgeist. He's totally acceptable, whereas 30 years ago, 20, he wasn't acceptable. And that's what happens constantly within history, within art. So,
well, it's what you were saying before, that there are certain figures that are very famous in their time, fall out of favor, and then return because what their message then resonates with the contemporary world.
So this is now the Ausländer coming in. The Ausländer comes in and says, it's not only art about the Holocaust. The Holocaust became the ultimate allegory in the Western culture. Not only the Holocaust, but World War II, the concept of absolute good versus absolute evil, the way that absolute evil dresses up, the way that victims are, the costumes of victims. It's like the only allegory that competes with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It is actually World War II. This is a Western hemisphere that is entirely inhabited, haunted by the allegory. So there's no art about the Holocaust enough because it's in every piece of popular culture. When I look at comics, I see the allegory. When I look at the mega blockbusters, what is Star Wars? Star Wars is basically a mix between the two allegories, the life of Jesus Christ and World War II. That's the futurism of these two allegories. When I look at the story of Hunger Games, the great, Hollywood blockbusters, what's that? It is a futuristic view of World War II. The Holocaust is in every element. It's everywhere. It still hurts. This is the title of my World War II big event end of this year, and I'm calling it Still Hurts. Because I walk as a foreigner around this continent for 6 years now, and everywhere I go, everybody is stuck in World War II. And I appreciate that. I'm not saying I appreciate it, I respect it very much, but I also see it, acknowledge it, recognize it. It's not overcome, it's not by, there's no next one. So this is not to undermine it, because I come from a similar experience, and I know it's very risky to compare anything to World War II. In the West, we can compare it to everything else in other parts of the world. But I produced a film 5 years ago, exactly tomorrow, that we released in Cannes, in Cold Water, which was considered to be maybe the most brutal film of the last 10-20 years. It's a film about what's happening in Syria, a documentary film. That was very, very brutal, very, very difficult to watch. A lot of violence. It was compared to the Shoah of Lansing, for example, in some newspapers and some critical reviews. And then the question keeps coming. Why is it so violent? We can't watch it. It's so hard to watch it. And you say, like, what? We don't know. This is this artistic approach. We're trying. We don't have a catalog, a manual, how to make a film about a big massacre. How do you make a film about genocide? Do you go study the history of films made about the Holocaust and then continue learning the lessons? No, you just make your own again. And if the same team are making the next film about another massacre, they will make it anew, and they don't know, they will not learn from the experience. It's like, it's unlike children touching fire and then learning never to touch it again. We never learn. We will always burn our finger because it is every time new. We don't get used to it. It's not banalizing, no matter how much the perpetrator is banalizing. The experience of being a victim is not banalizing. So there's no way, like it's everything, it's everywhere. And the question is how do we move on? And I don't mean move on in the sense of forget about it. No, I certainly don't mean this. I mean, how do we move on with wisdom? How do we stop trying just to protect the trauma? How do we make sure that when the day comes that the survivors of World War II and the Holocaust have passed away, I think that there is a huge investment now to make sure that the trauma is passed to the next generation as well, so that when the actual survivors pass away, we don't miss this trauma because we need it. We have to put it inside everybody's hearts. And I think this is scary. It's like, it's a triumph of evil in a way that we have to resist with art. And this art here, to me, is a question of complexity, of stopping this paradigm of binary, of absolutes, of this religious approach to good and evil, to black and white, and starting to appreciate that even the worst propaganda might be very sincere at some moment. I hope I'm not.
Just one thing I found amusing in researching this particular vision, because researching the Berlin show in 1947, was the idea that there were critics who said my father should have gotten over the Holocaust in 2 years. When 25, 30, 40 years later, there is an entire art industry dealing with the question of trauma and Holocaust. With this interim period in which no one was talking about it at all. But I think the question to ask in that respect is that remembering, commemoration is never going to, representation is never going to put anything to rest. And what to me emerges more and more as actually trying to maybe a model of repetition. That repetition is the way in which people carry on with history. That repeating and being obsessed is actually probably the most healthy, the only healthy attitude towards things that representation fails. So the fact that it keeps on coming back is partly because of its unrepresentability, and in the face of unrepresentability, as Freud wisely pointed out, you can only repeat. If you can't remember, you can repeat, and that's a sort of, it might be a very rudimentary form of coping with the past, but it may be sometimes the only form of working through of the past is repeating the past. Repeating the past in memory, not in action, of course.
So I'm looking out at the audience, and with a certain amount of Mitleid and gratitude, since this is taking place in a church which has notoriously uncomfortable seats, which I think is theologically intentional, and that the service shouldn't be too long, and the experience should have some element of suffering. Many of you have been here since 2:30, if my math is correct, which is rivals almost the Wagnerian opera. And so I would like to bring this to a close, and whether any of you would like to say something in closing, anything burning, and so we don't lose the moment. And failing to do that, I want to thank all of you for participating, and I thank all of you on behalf of Bar Berlin for coming, for the family of Henry Koerner for coming here, and for you for joining us in this discussion. And I want to thank my colleagues at Bar Berlin. I have always had the dream that this church would be used over and over every day for lectures and concerts, since it's our neighbor, and most of our undergraduates are not occupied Sunday morning anyway, so it's compatible with this religious use, and we're glad to have the church as our neighbor. And this dedication marks a new day for a very important enterprise in which the arts are important. If there's one thing about BARD that distinguishes itself from other American institutions, is the centrality of the making of art and the thinking about art and the writing about art, and that extends to BARD Berlin. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for participating.